All right, fine. So, hello everybody. So one of the first political organizations that I joined as a teenager, quite a while ago now, was CND, the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, back in the 80s, because at that time there was a very real concern that nuclear war was imminent, nuclear weapons were proliferating. Margaret Thatcher had just been elected in Britain, the country that I come from, Ronald Reagan in this country, and so it was a very militaristic time, and there were huge marches against both nuclear weapons and nuclear power, and that was one of the issues, along with the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, that really helped to politicize me. And ever since, once I became scientifically literate to a certain degree, and started teaching about physics and chemistry and so on, it just reinforced the idea that trying to split apart something that is 1/10,000,000th of a meter across to boil water in order to generate electricity is an insane idea, let alone the side aspects of accidents and so on and so forth. So I'm just going to speak a little bit about the broader kind of political and economic context to nuclear power, and I think in order to do that you really need to go back to the dawn of the nuclear age, where there were 2 atomic weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, and really pose the question, why would a country that had that kind of devastation wrought upon it, the only country to have nuclear weapons dropped on it, tens of thousands died immediately, and why would a country choose to have 30% of its energy provided by nuclear power when it had the devastating results of nuclear energy shown in the uncontrolled release of nuclear weapons? And I don't think you can really separate the two out, which is one of the main reasons, I think, to be against nuclear power, because all of the civil programs around the world came from, and the nuclear power plants for that matter, came from military purposes. And just to quote from a 1946 report by the US State Department, authored by Robert Oppenheimer, amongst others, the father of the Manhattan Project and so on. That report stated that, quote, "The development of atomic energy for peaceful purposes and the development of atomic energy for bombs are in much of their course interchangeable and interdependent." In other words, you can't really have a nuclear weapons program unless you've also got a civil nuclear power program. And you can see from the way in which there are 5 declared nuclear powers and 4 undeclared nuclear powers, and the 4 undeclared, well, all of them have developed their nuclear weapons programs from their civil nuclear program. And what it does is lead to an ever-escalating arms race, which is obviously now has the capacity to destroy the planet many times over. I think, how do we understand why countries chose to go down this route? When you look at the economics, and even the people who you might imagine would be in favor of the business of nuclear power generation, like Wall Street, like business investors, and so on, are against it. You can't find anybody to invest in nuclear power unless it's heavily subsidized by the government, in other words, by us. A 2009 report by Citibank, not a corporation that is known to turn its nose up at any form of risky investment, had this to say about nuclear power. I mean, the title of the report was Nuclear Power, the Economics Say No, and it outlined in quite a bit of detail why nuclear power was totally uneconomic and nobody should really be investing in it, because it had the potential to bring down even the largest corporate entity. According to the Congressional Budget Office, 50% of all nuclear loans go bad. The plant doesn't work out, and for that reason they need loan guarantees. George Bush granted free money to the nuclear industry, 18 billion. Barack Obama doubled that, another 36 billion. The nuclear industry itself says that's still not enough. What we need is 100 billion. With all kinds of other tax breaks and subsidies and so on and so forth. And so this is really a completely defunct industry, or it would be left to its own, market forces or whatever, if you believe in that kind of thing. It would be already out as an option. So from an economic standpoint, it doesn't actually make any sense whatsoever. From a safety standpoint, clearly there are. It doesn't need. I don't think I need to go into the fact that from a safety standpoint, it's a complete disaster. In terms of, I know that there is an argument on the left in general about the difference between coal power and nuclear power that maybe we could get into if people are interested. But nevertheless, the dangers, as Evan was saying, from Chernobyl, they're just trying to construct a new sarcophagus over Chernobyl. It cost $2 billion. They haven't managed to raise the money yet. They hope it's going to last for another 100 years, because the one that they put in place 25 years ago at the cost of so many lives is crumbling. And 95% of the nuclear fuel is still in Chernobyl. They haven't done anything with it. They can't. It's too radioactive. And so the only thing they could do is seal it up and build this new structure. They can't build it anywhere near Chernobyl itself, so it has to be transported on rails, built several miles away. It's going to be the largest thing that's ever been built and transported on rails if they can manage to do it. So all of that is obviously very scary. Reliability is another stated reason for nuclear power, and yet it's not. You have to build in about 15% extra electrical supply capacity to take into account that nuclear plants go down periodically, sometimes when you can predict, sometimes when you can't predict. The recent tornadoes actually had 2 nuclear plants in South Carolina had emergency shutdowns when the diesel generators had to kick in for a certain period of time. They were okay. But in this country, in terms of safety, according to the Union of Concerned Scientists, their recent report, there have been 14 near misses over the last year, any one of which could have potentially led to a meltdown. They didn't, but the potential was there. And for a mature industry, that's a lot. The idea that nuclear power could save us from climate change and is a green fuel is itself a complete misnomer, because that's not counting all of the mining. 1 in 5 uranium miners from the southwest in this country have some form of cancer. They're reopening all of the uranium mines. They want to, in fact, dig a new one in the Grand Canyon, of all places, which may or may not get authorized. And so if you include that and the construction of the plant itself and so on, and the decommissioning at the other end, not only is it hugely economic, but there are significant CO2 emissions from it as well. So the idea that something is long-lived, I mean, the US government, the NRC, claims that it's going to keep safe nuclear waste for 1 million years. Well, human civilization has only been around for 10,000 years. So the idea that we could build something that would keep radiation from contaminating water supplies and so on for 1 million years, as the government claims, is clearly ludicrous. So I think that we really need to kind of dig down into what are the other reasons for nuclear power, because just to quote Alexei Yablokov, who's a member of the Russian Academy of Scientists, and he was in charge of cleaning up, trying to prevent Chernobyl getting worse than it already was under Gorbachev. Speaking about Fukushima, he said, quote, "When you hear no immediate danger from nuclear radiation, then you should run away as far and as fast as you can." So presumably he's somebody who knows something about nuclear radiation. Or I like the headline from The Onion the other day. Nuclear energy advocates insist U.S. reactors completely safe unless something bad happens. If we're just going to discount economics, the reliability issue, safety, environmental concerns, then what's really left? Why do countries continue to pursue nuclear power? And Obama was just recently in Chile trying to have Chile sign a nuclear agreement for Chile to go nuclear. Chile, the site of a recent earthquake, almost as large as the one just happened in Japan, with a following tsunami, and yet President Obama is down there trying to sell nuclear technology. The U.S., according to Jimmy Carter, ex-president, is the worst offender when it comes to violating the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. It's established a nuclear deal with India in violation, essentially, of the NPT, in order to exchange nuclear technology, even though India has now developed its own nuclear weapons. And it's no coincidence that the 4 countries that have developed nuclear weapons are in some of the most unstable, volatile regions of the world, when you think about Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea. So what is it that is driving thanks. What is it that's driving this desire to go nuclear, even when nobody will actually back it? And according to the Wall Street Journal, the cost of nuclear power is 12 to 20 cents a kilowatt hour, and on average, renewable alternatives like wind and solar, wind in particular, is around about 6 cents per kilowatt hour. So far cheaper, right? To quote Zbigniew Brzezinski, National Security Advisor to Jimmy Carter, I think he puts it in terms that I think we can understand, because I think it's really all about geopolitics and the politics of empire. So he said, to put it in terminology that harkens back to the more brutal age of ancient empires, the 3 grand imperatives of imperial geostrategy are to prevent collusion and maintain security dependence among the vassals, to keep tributaries pliant and protected, and to keep the barbarians from coming together. In other words, yes, that would be us. In other words, as Japan has embraced being under the nuclear umbrella of the United States, that comes with a trade-off that it doesn't really have the option of developing its own independent energy sources. Now, Japan doesn't have much coal or oil or gas, so it is faced with the question: what are we going to do? And obviously, the U.S. has a direct interest in selling nuclear technology around the world, as it's trying to do right now, in order to enhance and make sure that it can maintain its great power status around the world. And all other countries, quite frankly, are in the same business, doing the same thing. I don't think you can understand why North Korea, for example, would develop nuclear weapons unless North Korea was looking at it was on the original axis of evil, right? Unless it saw what happened in Iraq, which was the other member of the axis of evil, didn't have weapons of mass destruction, so North Korea, and got invaded. North Korea in 2006 detonated its own nuclear weapon to make sure that it didn't follow the same kind of fate. And so I think that what we really have to look at is the real reasons. I'll just wrap up here. The real reasons for the expansion, the attempted expansion of nuclear power. There was a recent report in the Times just yesterday saying that nobody was really doing it because it's too expensive. The other scary thing about Japan, it was supposed to be so well prepared for all kinds of contingencies, and look what happened. Now we find out, the Times was reporting that they're having untrained day laborers work for $13 an hour in the most dangerous areas. 80% of nuclear workers in Japan are in fact contracted day laborers. This is the Times from the other day. Culture of complicity tied to stricken nuclear plant. And so if they're doing this in Japan, you can bet they're doing it here. Because it's really all about how much money are we going to make. And this is such a non-economic industry that every corner that they can legitimately cut without sparking accidents all over the place, they will tend to do. And so there is a whole history, a legacy from, I'm sure the other speakers will speak more to the history of accidents that haven't been reported, underreported, that any of which could have gone to further difficulties or expanded into larger problems. And so I really think it's about how would we imagine an energy grid that was actually renewable, that was distributed, that had, because the other thing about nuclear is they're so large, these plants, one goes down and then that's a huge chunk of your electricity supply. Or in Japan, when 17 of them go out all at once, then you lose a massive chunk of energy just when you most need it. And you can't just start up nuclear power plants, right? They take several days to get going again. The blackout that we had a few years ago here, when the nuclear plants went down, when you needed the energy to be replaced, you can't get it from nuclear power. You have to have it from others. And the wind turbines that actually exist in Japan are still operating, unlike the nuclear power plants. And so a distributed system of actual renewable energy would not only be cheaper, would not only be more reliable, but wouldn't generate massive amounts of nuclear waste, which nobody knows what to do with anywhere in the world. And so the advantages are obvious. But if you've got competing nation states all trying to either maintain their great power status or attain it around the world, then and therefore go off from nuclear power into nuclear weapons, then you have the situation that we currently have. And so without looking at that kind of situation, I don't think you can explain really why do they keep trying to do it. What would be some real alternatives for Japan or for us? How could we get off the 20% of nuclear energy that we are provided here? And I think what's exciting is that we're educating a new generation of anti-nuclear activists to get involved and try and explain the issues that are out there with nuclear power from the previous generation of people who were fighting in the 70s and the 1980s, and say, well, we didn't exactly know. Nobody really knew whether renewables would work or not in the 1970s and 1980s, right? There were some technical issues. Those are all solved, right? This is no longer a technical problem. It's purely a social and political problem. And I think what's exciting, the only good thing, to echo something that some Japanese anti-nuclear activists have said, the only good thing that could possibly come out of the disaster in Fukushima is that we end the production of power from nuclear sources and we move to a truly green and renewable energy future. And so, but I think we're going to have to fight for it. So.
In just the first month of existence. This is shutdownindianpointnow.org. This isn't global. This is just us. So we're doing something right. So I want to now introduce Tim Judson. Tim is the president of the Citizens Awareness Network, working as an organizer and policy analyst since 1998. In that time, he has been involved in all the major issues involving nuclear power in New York State and Vermont, as well as national issues involving nuclear security and radioactive waste. And Citizens Awareness Network, CAN, is a grassroots organization based in the Northeast, working to end our use of nuclear power and create a green energy economy. So thank you. Tim?
I'll go ahead and stand so people can see. Hi, thanks everyone. So I guess what I'm going to do is sort of cover some of the basics of nuclear power, and then talk about sort of what's happened at the Fukushima plant in Japan as a way to kind of bridge to with the implications of what that means for for us here in the States, and especially those of us living here near Indian Point and actually several other reactors that are close to the New York area. So I think the first thing I want to sort of talk about a little bit, because it's is actually what is about radiation and radiation exposure, because I think this is in the media one of the most persistently confused and confusing aspects of the talk about the consequences of the accident in Japan and nuclear power in general. They talk about radiation exposure levels. For instance, I think the most recent readings inside one of the reactors, one of the reactor buildings at Fukushima, they talk about readings of 1,120 millisieverts per hour. A sievert is a unit of radiation, of radiation exposure to the human body. It's an estimate of the damage that's done to the human body by an amount of radiation. But what they're talking about all the time in the media when they cite these numbers are what's called basically sort of external doses of radiation. Radiation coming, damage done to the body coming from radiation sources that are outside the body, right? So this is mostly, what's called gamma radiation, which is, the kind of radiation that you need about 3 feet of concrete or, 20 feet of water to be able to block effectively. But there's actually 3 different kinds of radiation that come from from nuclear power and radioactive waste, and gamma radiation is the most potent of those and the one that is of most concern in terms of short-term radiation exposures and deaths. The other two are what's called alpha particles and beta particles. An alpha particle is essentially a positively charged, a nucleus of a helium atom. Basically stripped of its electrons, that is shot out when certain types of radioactive elements decay. A beta particle is sort of the opposite. It's a negatively charged particle, basically an electron that's ejected from the nucleus of an atom when it decays. Now, both those kinds of radiation are not as dangerous coming from outside your body. For instance, nuclear fuel before it goes into a reactor primarily emits alpha particles, and if you can hold a nuclear fuel rod before it goes into a reactor relatively safely with your hand, with a glove on it, will block most of the alpha radiation coming off. The problem is when these radioactive particles get inside your body, and that's the real danger from the long-term exposure resulting from both the normal operation of a nuclear power plant and the consequences of an accident like at Chernobyl or Fukushima or 3 Mile Island. The kind of particles that are being emitted, the kind of radioisotopes that are being emitted, are things like cesium-137, which is an element that's chemically the same as potassium, which means it's used in the salts in every single cell of your body. There's iodine-131, which can easily cause the thyroid cancer or other problems to your thyroid gland, because your thyroid gland relies on iodine a lot. There's strontium-90, which is chemically the same as calcium, which gets in your bones and is known to be a factor in leukemia and and other bone cancers and and immune system disorders. So this is what this really sort of is being not talked about in terms of the exposures to the population in Japan that are going to result from this, is the seepage of radioactive contaminants into the environment, and then once those get inside people's bodies, the long-term consequences of cancer, birth defects, immune disorders, those sorts of things. That's sort of the baseline, I want to kind of have people thinking about in terms of radiation exposures in the environment. Now, the other thing we need to understand to understand what's going on at Fukushima, is what nuclear fuel is and how it works in a reactor. Now, there's lots of reasons. It's that quote that Chris read about how there's not a problem with nuclear power unless there's a problem. I actually disagree with. I think there's actually plenty of reasons to oppose nuclear power, even when it's operating normal, and without having a major accident. I have a different talk I can give about that at a different time. But in terms of the way, in terms of nuclear safety and these kind of accidents, it's really important to understand what nuclear fuel is. The nuclear fuel that's used in reactors like the ones in Japan and the ones in the U.S. Is based on what's called enriched uranium. What's enriched uranium? The uranium that occurs in the environment is composed of a number of different forms of uranium, a number of different isotopes. Some of them are more radioactive than others, but they're all radioactive. But the one that's useful in terms of a nuclear reaction is called uranium-235. It's the one that can actually cause a nuclear chain reaction, a fission reaction. That is only in the environment in about a concentration of about 0.7% of the uranium that's out there. To be useful in the reactor, they need to increase that concentration to about 3.5%. That's what's called enrichment, and the fuel that's in the reactor is enriched uranium. Now, another thing to understand about what this means in terms of the consequences of nuclear power for the environment are that to enrich uranium, you have to basically mine uranium out of the ground, refine it, and then enrich it. And in that process, for every pound of nuclear fuel you get, you produce about 4,000 pounds of radioactive waste in the process. So there's a waste stream for nuclear power before it even hits, before you even generate any kind of electricity at all. And this is actually a massive issue of environmental justice and environmental racism, because the places where the uranium is mined and where that waste is dumped are predominantly low-income, Native American and other people of color communities in the U.S. and abroad. But once you have the uranium that's enriched, it's fabricated into thousands and thousands of long pencil-thin rods, And those are then, put inside the reactor. I think in a lot of reactors, like the ones in Japan and the U.S., it's about 30,000 of these rods are in the reactor. They're configured in such a way that they create a nuclear chain reaction that, that ostensibly can be controlled. The problem is, with something like Fukushima, is that, it's not that difficult to lose control of that reaction. But they're put in these rods in the core of the reactor. Water is fed through them, which then boils and is used to turn a turbine to generate electricity. That's all a nuclear power plant does, is it boils water, and then turns it into electricity. I was, when I first started doing this work, I sort of hadn't thought about that, and I thought there was some magical, sort of thing that happened with radiation that made electricity. But no, it's just boiling water, just like a coal plant, just like a natural gas-fired power plant, just like an oil-fired power plant. The problem is that you can't turn off the nuclear core. You can stop generating electricity with it, but the problem is, but the radiation, but the fuel rods continue to be incredibly hot and incredibly radioactive, far longer after you stop generating electricity. And that's what Chris means when it's, you can't just turn on and off a nuclear reactor. It's quite an intricate process to be able to safely start up and shut down a nuclear reactor. If the cooling to the core gets disrupted for even a few minutes, you can end up with a nuclear accident very quickly. There's also, in the process of starting or shutting down the reactor, once the chain reaction starts, even at a very low level of power, you can end up with a flash of radiation that can actually cause an explosion and a meltdown. And that's actually happened at a couple of different times in the history of nuclear power. And it's actually what happened at Chernobyl. The Chernobyl accident was actually caused by the fact that they were running an experiment to see, if you could shut down the reactor using the power it was generating itself. In a case like what happened to Fukushima, where they lost all the power to the reactor from off-site, by the earthquake, and the backup power generators on site were wiped out by the tsunami. In a case like that, where the reactor was still generating steam because of the heat that was coming off of it, could you use the electricity generated by that steam to power down the reactor? And so, of course, as the reactor is shutting down, there's less and less electricity being generated, and what happened at Chernobyl was they were running an experiment to see if you could do that, and they lost control of it, and the reactor exploded. But what happens in a meltdown is a couple of things. One is that once you've lost the normal cooling to the reactor, the water starts to boil out of the out of the reactor cooling system, and you lose enough of it that actually the fuel rods in the core of the reactor become exposed. The water dips below the level of the fuel rods, and then they start to really, really overheat. And what also happens is that the fuel rods themselves are encased. There's a thin cladding around the uranium that's made of a metal called zircaloy. Now, zircaloy gets its name because one of its major components is an element called zirconium. Zirconium has an unfortunate chemical characteristic, which is that it's explosive. But what it also does is, at a very high temperature, before it reaches a temperature where it would explode, if it's in water, it actually creates a chemical reaction with the water where it strips out the hydrogen and the oxygen and creates a massive amount of hydrogen very, very quickly. So what happens in a meltdown is that you have the fuel becoming exposed. You have, once that happens, a lot of hydrogen being produced, by this chemical reaction with the fuel rods, that can itself cause an explosion. But once the fuel rods have become uncovered and start to really overheat like that, they can also start to melt. And once the zirconium cladding around the fuel starts to burn, the uranium fuel can start to crumble out of there and melt and congeal, and sort of collect in the bottom of the reactor. And once that starts to happen, you can have a nuclear chain reaction that you can no longer control at all because you have just a molten mass of uranium. And that can then melt through the reactor vessel once it reaches this, if that reaction is continuing. And then once it melts through the reactor vessel, then it can, it can drop onto the floor of the reactor building, burn through the concrete floor of the reactor, and then once it hits the water table, cause a massive steam explosion that can basically blow apart the building and any containment structure that was designed to prevent the massive release of radiation. That's been the game that they've been playing at Fukushima for the last month and a half, is trying to prevent that type of disaster from happening. And what's becoming clear, even though they haven't been able to really survey enough of the internals of the reactor buildings to know, is that actually that some of the fuel has been melting out of the reactor vessels. These extremely high levels of radiation that they're finding, particular types of isotopes they're finding in the water that's inside the reactor buildings, could only come from the core of the reactor. And so the theory is that actually, there's a certain amount of the fuel that's been melting through the bottom of the reactors. And then, and they're really scrambling right now to figure out how they can control the situation. And I mean, it seems like there's a chance that every day goes by that the worst doesn't happen. It makes it a little less likely that that something that the worst kind of an accident could transpire. But I think the reality is that actually the worst can still happen at Fukushima. Now, the other thing to know about nuclear fuel and what's happened at Fukushima and what could happen at Indian Point is that when the fuel is taken out of the reactor core, after it's no longer useful for producing electricity, it's about 1 million times more radioactive than when it went in, and can still sustain a nuclear chain reaction. So the fuel itself that's taken out has to be kept basically in a pool of water for years. Until it cools down enough that it could be stored in some other fashion. But the problem is that by having to store a bunch of basically what's called spent nuclear fuel, it's really more irradiated nuclear fuel in these pools of water for a long time, means that you could actually have a very similar type of accident happen in a fuel pool that could happen in the reactor. And you'll remember that there were 3 reactors at Fukushima that were still operating when the earthquake hit. There are 3 other reactors on that site, and one of those other reactors had an accident in its fuel pool, even though the reactor wasn't operating. And the problem is that while there are backup cooling systems for the reactors, there are no backup cooling systems in those reactors for the spent fuel pools. And so when the power was knocked out, basically over a few days, the pool in the spent fuel, the water in the spent fuel pool at reactor number 4, basically started to boil off, and there's evidence now that there's actually a nuclear chain reaction happening in the fuel pool of reactor building number 4. There's also been an accident happening in the spent fuel pool of reactor number 3, and and those explosions that happened at all 4 of those reactors, in reactor number 3 and reactor number 4, those explosions were caused by the hydrogen being generated in the fuel pools of those reactors. At reactor number 1 and reactor number 2, those explosions happened as a result of hydrogen being generated by the exposed cores in the reactors, and all of that has also complicated the recovery efforts, because with the massive explosions that happened, there's an incredible, the buildings themselves have been destroyed, and there's a massive amount of debris, and to be able to install the new cooling pumps that are necessary to really get the situation under control, the amount of, the engineering feat of having crews come in to do that work in those kind of conditions, it's almost, engineers are having an impossible time conceiving of how to do that work. And so that's really the struggle that they're under right now. So just as a way to close this, for it to be clear that it's the earthquake that hit Japan isn't what caused this accident. The reactors were still operating after the earthquake hit. What happened, what's causing the accident, and what could cause an accident at any for any number of reasons at a nuclear power plant here or anywhere else, is first of all the loss of the off-site power, from basically the power lines being down and the reactors losing their connection to the electric grid, and then the tsunami wiping out the emergency diesel generators, which were their backup source of power, And after that point, they only had 8 hours, with the backup batteries on site to be able to get the situation under control. And in some situations where you have a power outage, the 8 hours is enough. But in a situation like that, it was literally just a ticking time bomb. But again, the same thing could happen here. And in fact, these tornadoes in the south have actually wiped out a power to a 3-reactor complex in Alabama called Browns Ferry, which is the same design as the reactors in Japan. And their backup generators haven't been taken out and are operating, but the backup generators at nuclear power plants in the U.S. have a very, very common tendency to fail. And with that kind of a situation, it gets spiral out of control really quickly. So thanks.
Nails down on the sign-up sheet, so we could let you know of further actions. And those are at the table in the front. Also, want to let you know that this room is costing about $200 to rent. So please leave a contribution on your way out at the table. And then there are other costs associated with having having meetings like banners and printing. So please be generous. I wanted to. Okay, there's going to be a nice, lovely brown bag that's going to be passed around. Find something quieter, like a hat. It's too noisy for the audio cameras. I wanted to introduce Marilyn Elie, who is sitting on my right. She's been working to close Indian Point for the last 17 years, and she's still fighting. She is the co-founder of the Westchester Citizens Awareness Network and one of the original members of the Indian Point Safe Energy Coalition, IPSEC, which is a coalition of grassroots and environmental organizations in the lower Hudson Valley. She became involved in this issue because of her concern about the unsolvable problem of the high level of radioactive waste, a toxic legacy which we are passing on to untold generations. Marilyn has also learned to watchdog the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. She has regularly attended NRC committee meetings and has seen 3 regional directors come and go. She has learned how to read NRC reports for what is hidden between the lines, and on occasion is the only person in the room who can attest to the changes in the regulatory position, because she was there at the original meetings. So please welcome Marilyn Elie. Thanks.
Thank you, Evan. And I really want to acknowledge how much Tim Judson has meant to closing Indian Point from the very beginning. There were 4 of us in a little organic cafe in Peekskill wondering what we were going to do, what was our next step going to be, and Tim drove for hours and came down and looked at who was at the table and listened to what we were doing and said, "You've got enough people here to close that plant, go for it." And we've been doing that ever since, so thank you, Tim. I think I'm going to give you something to look at as I'm talking. This is the Times from Friday, April the 22nd, bidding goodbye to the nuclear zone. I thought this photograph was so desolate. I can see it happening in Peekskill. I live 2 miles from the plant, and it wouldn't look like this in New York City, but it certainly could look like this in a lot of the river towns. New York City would be a lot more chaotic. But there will be some kind of exclusion zone for who knows how long around Fukushima. And nuclear power plants like Indian Point make very near neighbors of us all. As the crow flies, you are about less than 25 miles right here from Indian Point. Take a look at that and think of how you would feel if it came here. Thanks. I also have some pictures of Fukushima. I don't know if you've had a chance to actually see what those reactors look like and how devastated they are. I'll start some on this side and some on the other side. They're labeled. This is from the website of the Union of Concerned Scientists. And if you really want some great information, they're the best I have found. Pass those on back, and I'll start these over here. I can't imagine that they're going to end up doing anything but a sarcophagus on some of those reactors, especially when you see those photographs. And I found these, actually a friend sent them to me, I got them in the mail. This is from an early demonstration. We have been trying to close this plant for a very long time, and now with the relicensing, it is a matter of do it now, or wait another 20 years. So we really are at a critical point. But Valerie made this sign a long time ago. They moved. She's not here anymore. I'm really glad I've got the picture. The fact that humans have built nuclear power plants proves that they cannot be trusted to operate them safely. So I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of many, many Hudson Valley activists. Hudson Valley all the way from Trail of the Tears, where the Hudson River starts, down to New York City Bay. We're all Hudson Valley, and we're all environmentalists if we care for that river and if we care for where we live. And many of us have gone before. So now is the time to really look at that tradition, draw on it, and move forward, and really getting rid of Indian Point. And I think I want to really start what I'm trying to tell you with some parallels, actually. 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Davis-Besse, Katrina, Deepwater Horizon, and now Fukushima all have something in common. And what they have in common are engineers who said, we've got plenty of fail-safe systems, don't worry about it. Plus corporations that make a lot of money and say, no problem, look, we've got the engineers, we've got the redundant systems, we're good to go, not to worry. Plus regulatory agencies that are weak to non-existent. And when they tell you no danger to the public, that's when you really better be careful. Because there's so much danger in any situation that brings together those three things. It's profit that runs the plant, and it's not great regulations or good regulators that are going to close it down. It's a political process. And that's why what's going on here in this room right now in New York City and in Westchester and all the points up north is so important. We really have to do it politically. We really have to be organized, and I'm counting on everybody in this room. I can't tell you what to do. I don't know your legislators. I don't know your situations. I know mine, but you've got to make choices here, and I'm hoping that the Shutdown Indian Point movement, right, will really be a vehicle. And maybe that's too broad an umbrella. What we have found after the last go round after 9/11 was that individual groups and individual neighborhoods were what were most effective. So you may have to do it borough by borough. You may have to do it neighborhood by neighborhood. But however you do it, you need to be working and doing something. Tim has talked about the spent fuel pools, and there is no protection. I won't belabor that point. You did a fine job with that, Tim. Thank you. Regular commercial Kmart type buildings. Not something that we need to store 100,000 tons of radioactive waste in. My own feeling, and that of Ken and many others who look at this, is that we use that material, and we need to keep it there. We need to be responsible for it and not ship it away to somebody else who doesn't want it or else is too poor to say no. So what we do with stuff like that is to stop making it. And I'm putting this right up front because it's one of the reasons that I have looked at over the years. There is no solution. Now, the President's Blue Ribbon panel is going to come out in June, and they're going to be talking about what to do with the waste, and they're going to be coming to some kind of agreement or make recommendations. Looking at who's on that panel, my guess is that they're going to be recommending reprocessing. And I sort of want to inoculate you against that. Reprocessing is not a way we should go. We can talk more about it in the question and answer session if you want to, but it's not recycling, and don't let anybody tell you it is. it uses the plutonium, which is about 1/3 of the spent fuel rods that, we should really say irradiated rods that Tim was talking about, uses it once, leaves a mess, and makes a fuel that's even worse, if you can imagine such a thing. So don't buy into the reprocessing. But what I really wanted, my job is to tell you more about Indian Point. And how many of you have ever been out on the Hudson River? Okay, it's a heritage river that belongs to all of us. And Indian Point has done great damage to that river. There are two ways it does damage to the river. First of all, there's a 40-foot, I guess probably about the size of this room, that's about 40 foot, more or less, and maybe less actually. So that's where the river water comes in. And what happens inside that plant, and all nuclear power plants, is that the machinery is really big, it's really hot, and you got to cool it. So they use the river water. There are two different loops inside Indian Point, like other power plants and nuclear plants, and that water, the heat, the water that comes in from the river is used to pick up the excess heat. I'm not going to talk to you about the inside of the plant unless you want to in question and answers, but just know there's a transfer of heat. So that loop runs along, picks up the heat, and then it goes out the other end with water that is 30 degrees higher than ambient river temperature. Now, for a fish, that's like a person running into a wall when they have that much of a difference between the river temperature that they're swimming along and doing their fish thing and this thermal plume that comes out of Indian Point. I have a picture I'll show you in a minute. There was a picture that Riverkeeper took showing the way the water, the hot water, goes across and makes a barrier, a physical barrier. So it kills fish on two ends. First on the intake through impingement and entrainment, and worse than that, through sucking in all the eggs and the fry and all the microorganisms that make up the bottom of the food chain, which create a healthy river, aquatic environment. And then on the other side, it kills billions more through this thermal pollution. That power plant has changed the ecology of the Hudson River. We have 13 native species, and 6 of them are now endangered, including the short-nosed sturgeon, which is a signature fish for the Hudson River. And it's because of the intake and the fact that the Hudson River is tidal. So they have many different chances as the tide moves up and comes down near that intake, moves up and comes down near that intake. So that plant kills way out of proportion of the numbers of fish than other plants along the Hudson River. And so what we're asking for, and what we need to support our DEC in, is closed cycle cooling. It would cut down water use by 95%. It would cut down fish mortality by 97%. Now this is not closed. This is not the cooling towers. I don't know if you've heard Entergy's advertisements about wedge wire and cooling towers and all that. All the DEC is asking for is what's required by the Clean Water Act, and that's closed cycle cooling. A lot of different ways to do it. Probably what they'll do when they finally push comes to shove is mechanical draft, because it's cheaper. Short, squat industrial buildings that have fans and other equipment in them that take that water, reuse it, cool it off, and let it go back and go through the plant again, thus cutting down the water that is used by the single largest water user in the state, Indian Point, and that all those fish deaths, so that we can have, once the PCBs are cleaned up, we can have a vibrant fishing industry, and we can all use the river more safely. So that's the water usage and a little bit about the closed cycle cooling. I would like to tell you that what the company, Entergy, the owner of the plant, is proposing is something called wedge wire, and that's just a glorified screen that goes across the opening. There's already a screen there, but they say, well, we don't want to take the plant down, there's too much, it's too costly, so we're just going to put this fancy screen across it and call it wedge wire. But wedge wire, while it can't really be effective in a fast-moving river by the Hudson, might save a few fish, it does nothing for the thermal pollution. So that's another thing you want to be sure not to buy into. Okay. The other thing that comes up where I live, thank you, and I'll finish with this replacement electricity. You can see, I put these, I hope you can see over there, I put some signs up here, just little tags about different aspects of Indian Point, and it gets to be complicated when you start looking at it in detail. The taxes that the plant pays, the security of the plant, well, we talked about the Hudson River. What does it do for the local economy? The health benefits that Tim touched on, maybe the resolutions that we all need to be thinking about. But let's look at replacement energy for the next maybe 3 or 4 minutes, because that's what I get a lot of. We can't do without the electricity. What would we do if all of this electricity, 2,000 megawatts, was taken off the grid? The lights would go out. The subways wouldn't run. Well, that's a lie. Indian Point goes down all the time. Sometimes it's planned, sometimes it's not planned. However it does, the lights stay on and the subway keeps running. And the big deal that I astonished me that came up just about, I think, 3 months ago, we found this out. Indian Point no longer sells all of its electricity to Consolidated Edison and the New York Power Authority. They used to. When Entergy came in and purchased the plant, they had a real sweetheart deal. They purchased the plant, they got a great deal from the state, which they're still paying back, and then they had a guaranteed buyer for all the electricity, the 2,000 megawatts that they could produce. Well, contracts don't last forever, even with electricity. So 5 years is a long-term contract for Indian Point. But no one actually thought to go back and look at it until just a few months ago, when one of the reporters was doing some investigative work and found out that, guess what? Indian Point is now selling a combined total to Consolidated Edison and New York Power Authority 570 megawatts. That comes out to be somewhere between 4 and 5% of the energy peak usage. And I want to keep you with me. I don't want you to be bored, and I don't want to see eyes glaze over. But you really need to understand how this gets figured. Figure on a day like today, maybe when it's a little cooler, and so air conditionings aren't going on, and your peak usage for New York City and Westchester is going to be about 9,000 megawatts. Well, if Indian Point is selling and Con Ed is delivering 560 of those megawatts, that's 4 to 5%. When the usage goes up in the summer, when all of us are using about 13%, or 1,300 megawatts, then their percentage goes down. When the usage goes up, the percentage goes down. Does that make sense? It's like 4th grade math, okay? So you're figuring a percentage here. So figure peak usage, not how much they generate. Who cares? I don't care what they do with that. I don't care where they sell it, and I just don't care. It's going elsewhere. I'm concerned about this community, and our community is Westchester and New York City. We're all part of one big grid. You can't really tease us apart. That's the way the grid developed. It's called the New York City, or it's called the New York service area, but it includes the city and it includes Westchester. And everything that comes into that grid is distributed throughout it by Con Ed. And you can see in their annual report from last year exactly the figure that they are purchasing and are contracting with Indian Point. Not only that, it's going down. So my contention is that the market has already replaced Indian Point. We don't have to worry about where the electricity goes or how we're going to get more, because there's a free market in deregulated electricity. And the big players are seeing profit here. They're coming in. You've got several different power projects that are coming in, cables under the Hudson, cables coming down from Canada, supplying more electricity, and people are going to make a lot of money. Business people are going to make a lot of money, and maybe that's as it should be. It's a free, unregulated market in electricity, and it has handled the problem of where we're going to get our electricity. So what we need to do is really tell people, we need to understand it thoroughly ourselves, and tell all the people around here that think Indian Point is going to, generates 40% of our electricity, that they're just simply wrong. You don't look at how much they can generate, you look at how much we're using. And if we're not using that much, and if it's that dangerous, why on earth do we want to keep doing it? It's a low probability, perhaps, but it's a really high impact. And how much electricity is 20 million lives worth? You know, ask somebody the next time they say, oh, we can't do without the electricity. Can't we? I think we can. Thank you.
For the company to absorb. CAN began in 1991 in a small community in western Massachusetts along the Deerfield River in the northwest corner. The Yankee Row reactor. It was struck by lightning on Father's Day weekend in 1991, and it knocked out the power to the control room of the reactor for 30 minutes. So for 30 minutes, that reactor was basically sort of driving blind. They couldn't tell what was going on inside, and it could have easily caused an accident. And the community sort of woke up about that. This small rural community or small rural farming community, and started organizing, started having meetings, and a bunch of things came out. Not only was the reactor routinely dumping radioactive waste into the river, which Indian Point and all other reactors also do. But the reactor vessel that contains the core, was 30 years old and had become embrittled, and they were doing some studies of basically sort of what that meant, and what the Nuclear Regulatory Commission found out was that where they're supposed to run a reactor with not less than a 1 in a million chance of an accident, Yankee Row, because of this embrittled reactor vessel, actually had a 1 in 10,000 chance of an accident. It's 100 times more likely to melt down than was legal. And they were working behind the scenes with the utility company basically to change the regulations to make that okay. People in the community, the activists, they sort of went into this NRC back then had what were called public document rooms in every reactor community, and we actually found that correspondence between the utility and the NRC and exposed it, and the exposure within the press basically forced the NRC to back off of that and require that they basically fix the reactor vessel, and it was too expensive, and the reactor was kind of small anyway, and the utility company basically decided it wasn't worth the cost and shut it down. Now, then a few years later, there were all 4 reactors in Connecticut were found to be completely mismanaged. There were whistleblowers who'd come out, and then the grassroots organizations like CAN, started putting a lot of pressure basically for the utility to fix this systemic mismanagement at the reactors. And so, we did a lot of work to basically sort of force we exposed this to the NRC that there was these, systemic, safety problems throughout the plants, and so the NRC told the utility company that they were going to have to fix it. And ultimately, 2 of those 4 reactors never came back online. The same thing happened at the main Yankee reactor. Very similar story with where basically there were safety problems. What happened after this episode of reactor closures in New England and elsewhere, which were a result of basically citizen pressure to force the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to enforce its own regulations, was that the NRC started changing the rules, right? And so basically what the NRC did was they changed their whole inspection process. They changed the way that they enforced their regulations. They even changed a lot of the regulations to make it impossible to shut nukes that way. And then, through this process of relicensing where, this is, I don't know if you guys sort of are up to speed on this, but, reactors are normally licensed to operate for 40 years. Now, we haven't built any reactors in the U.S. in almost 30 years, so they're all coming up on those 40-year expiration dates. So the NRC created a process called relicensing, where they can apply to get a 20-year extension on those licenses, and that's what's happening in Indian Point right now. Now, there's been 60 of these things that have already been passed so far. The NRC hasn't denied a single license extension request. The NRC, what CAN basically decided several years ago was that the NRC is dead to us. The NRC is not going to close another single reactor in the country without massive political pressure coming from the administration, who are basically the commission's bosses. And we don't see that kind of that sort of possibility happening with even the Obama administration, who has his ties to the industry are too strong, coming from Illinois, which is the most nuclear state in the country. So we took a different approach. We realized that actually there was a lot of things that states could do, still even under the Atomic Energy Act, which gives the majority of the authority to the federal government. But states still can do things, can still regulate aspects of nuclear power that relate to things like the economics of the state, the economic impacts on the state, those sort of things. And so what we did in Vermont was, we actually, which deregulated somewhat similarly to the way that New York deregulated its electric industry. But it reserved some powers to itself. But what we did was we got the state to pass a law that said that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission granting a license extension wasn't enough. That actually the state had to continue to issue, what's called a certificate of public good, which utility companies have to have, to get basically their assets approved by the Public Utility Commission. So we got this Act 160 passed, which basically forced the Entergy, which also owns Indian Point, to have to go to the state legislature and get a law and get another law passed authorizing them to submit an application for a license extension to the state, which put us in a position where basically Entergy had to get a law passed in order to continue operating its reactor, which put us in a position where all we had to do was make sure that law didn't pass. And in February 2010, that happened. We won the vote. Vermont Yankee is set to close down in March of next year, in 2012, in Vermont. Well, and actually Peter Shumlin, the current governor, who was the head of the Senate when that vote took place, on Vermont Yankee, has pushed both those things. So he's trying to build his progressive credentials and doing a pretty good job of it. But the basic point being that that we have more control over the politics of how to close of nuclear power within our states than we do with the federal government. And the federal government is basically paralyzed on the issue, of dealing with the safety implications of nuclear power. It's going to happen at the state level, if anything's going to happen. And and there's definitely things that the Cuomo administration can do to give New York that same hook to be able to close Indian Point and the other reactors in the state. There's 4 more upstate. And actually, somebody asked about the issue of contamination in the food supply for the state. There are figures on that actually, and and several years ago there were concerns about the levels of iodine-131 in the milk that was being delivered to New York City, coming not from Indian Point, but being released from the reactors upstate in Oswego County, where there's actually a fair amount of cattle farming and and a milk industry. So it's not just Indian Point that affects New York City. The reactors throughout the region also have an effect on us. But anyway, so that's the main thing I wanted to get across was that it's going to take an incredible amount of grassroots organizing. It's been a 15-year campaign in Vermont. We've been organizing in Vermont to close Vermont Yankee for 15 years, and it's going to happen. But it could be a long fight. And it's definitely worth it because, the consequences of an accident at Indian Point, if one were to happen, could destroy would destroy the region. But by virtue of destroying this region, could also, have a major impact even on the national and the global economy. The NRC actually commissioned a study from Sandia National Labs back in 1982. To look at what the consequences of accidents at nuclear power plants would be throughout the country. And what they found was that, and this is, I'm adjusting it for 2011 dollars, if there were a reactor meltdown at Indian Point 2, like the kind that happened at Chernobyl, there would be $600 billion in property losses as a result of that accident. For Indian Point 3, which is a slightly larger reactor, there would be $700 billion just in property losses. People's contaminated homes basically being unusable within whatever that exclusion zone was. That's a huge impact. Thousands and thousands of deaths. For I think Indian Point 3, 160,000 people would be hospitalized with radiation injuries. 160,000, and that's just from the reactor. The fact of the matter is that in the fuel pools at Indian Point, there's probably 7 to 10 times as much radioactivity in the fuel pools as exist in the reactors. Because we don't have any solution for nuclear waste, they've been packing the pools with the spent fuel coming out of the reactors more and more tightly because they're beyond the original capacity of what was to be stored in the pools, And now those spent fuel pools are packed with nuclear fuel as densely as the cores of the reactor, but with about 7 times as much fuel in them. So what we're talking about, if there was an accident in one of the fuel pools at Indian Point, would be a release of radiation, not, what was it, 4,000, no, yeah, not 400 times what was released in the Hiroshima bomb, like what happened at Chernobyl, but on the level of like 10,000 times. I mean, it's something like 40 million curies of cesium-137 are in the fuel pool of Indian Point 2. Now, there were only 5,000 curies of cesium-137 released in the Hiroshima atomic blast. So we're talking about massive amounts of radiation. There were 2 million curies of cesium-137 released from the meltdown at Chernobyl. So we're talking about 20 times the volume of radioactivity that was released from Chernobyl. That would create basically an uninhabitable zone of about 37,000 square miles. That's about 3/4 the size of New York State. That would be uninhabitable for decades. So I mean, the fact of the possibility, the consequences of an accident at Indian Point are so great that it actually, I mean, the politics of the situation, I think we actually have a really great way to be able to to leverage the state, to take the actions that are necessary to close the plant. But it's going to take a tremendous amount of grassroots organizing to make it happen. So, thanks.
Yeah, if people want more information on nuclear-related topics, one good website is nirs.org, Nuclear Information Resource Service. You can also check out nucfree.org, nucfree, N-U-K-E, free.org, or the Union of Concerned Scientists has a lot of really great information, ucs.org. So any of those 3 websites, really great material, fact sheets, and so on. ucsusa.org. Just to answer a few quick questions. I mean, the situation in Fukushima is absolutely not stabilized, according to the NRC in this country. And aftershocks can go on for many months, and they can be at least as powerful as the original, in some cases more powerful. So when asked, one of the nuclear spokesmen for TEPCO, the Japanese company, how long are you going to have to continue with this emergency cooling for? What should we be thinking? How long are people going to have to stay, 300,000 people, right, in emergency shelters? How long is that going to go on for? He said people should be thinking of quite some time. I'm talking years, not months. So that is from the industry. And so it is an ongoing calamity, which at the moment has no real end in sight. Just on the testing, radiation testing, they do pretty much routinely test now for food and fish and so on, incoming radiation. Whether we can use that or not, I don't know, but it's an interesting thing to look at, I think. Just on, I guess, want to address, well, I'll talk a little bit about coal and nuclear, because there is this big debate. Well, coal kills more people than nuclear in an average year, right? Every year in this country, about 13,000 people die because of respiratory ailments and stuff that are enhanced by the kind of air that we have to breathe because of the coal plants. 50% of electricity here is generated from coal. So, and then you build in the mining accidents and so on and so forth, and there's a point there. I think the problem with that argument is it's a false dichotomy, right? Nobody's arguing that we should be choosing between one horrendous industry and another horrendous industry. And the real danger of that argument is if you demobilize the anti-nuclear movement, then you demobilize all movements to a certain extent for clean energy. And so I think you're actually setting your own movement back, because if you accept nuclear, it's going to be way easier to accept coal and so on and so forth. And in reality, in this country, the biggest nuclear power producer, Exelon, is 50% nuclear and 50% coal. So it's not like these two things are disconnected from each other in any case. So they will, if we demobilize the anti-nuke movement based on we want coal, we'll actually get both, and we'll end up with the worst of both worlds. In terms of what we can do, well, I think we have to remember that most people in this country are so anti-nuclear. They haven't been able to build new nuclear plants for so long, since 3 Mile Island. Didn't come from nowhere, right? It was actually a movement that generated that feeling that there is a gut level anti-nuclear feeling in this country, however much you know or don't know about it. And so, the biggest ever demonstration in this city in 1982 was against nuclear power and nuclear weapons. 750,000 people in Central Park, like an amazing thing, right? So, and they haven't been able to build nuclear plants since then. That's why they have to relicense. And the other reason they need to relicense instead of build new ones is it's so wildly non-economic. They can't afford to build new ones, even with all of these subsidies, right? So that's why they're relicensing and why they want to do it. But of course, talking about relicensing 40-year-old plants not only is unsafe, but when are you ever going to then develop? When are we talking about moving to a clean energy, non-carbon, etc., into the latter half of this century is when you're really talking about it. So it's really putting off a transition to an actual renewable future, which there are many, many studies out there. I could cite any number of them that illustrate that we could generate all of our electricity and other things from solar, wind, geothermal, existing hydro, tidal, and so on and so forth. Of course, there are trade-offs. There are trade-offs with anything that we do, or any other species for that matter. We change our environment just like everybody else, everything else. But not to the extent that the legacy of our energy production goes on for hundreds of thousands of years into the future, and we have no idea what to do with it. So a recent poll in the Washington Post, 64% of Americans are against building new nuclear power plants, 59% are strongly against, and so I think we've got a really good basis on which to mobilize a movement. And I think there's a couple of things that we should look to in that regard. Germany, right, was about to relicense 17 of its all 17 of its plants, including the 7 oldest ones. There's a huge demonstration, 45,000 people, and they formed a chain, 45 kilometers long chain, between 2 cities and a nuclear plant. And now Angela Merkel, who's totally pro-nuclear and so on and so forth, wanted to relicense them and said they're unsafe. They shut down 7 of them immediately. They're already shut, right? And she's talking about how can we shut down the rest. So yeah, extremely exciting. Many other countries have put their plans on hold. Switzerland, China, lots of other countries. Not this one, right? If you want to vote for a national political party and you're anti-nuclear, you actually can't have a vote. There's nobody for you to vote for, Democrat, Republican, right? They're just as much into it. Right. So we clearly need we clearly need, well, there's lots of stuff about the Green Party in Germany which is good and bad. We could get into that debate. But we clearly need our own independent political party, that's for sure, right? Because we cannot go down this road that we've been going down and telling us that they've got answers when they really haven't. And so I think it is going to be about, well, how could we form a chain from New York City to Indian Point, right? How viable is that? How could we go out on tablings, tomorrow at the demonstration for May Day, right? International Worker Solidarity. How could we table at different events to get more people to sign up and get more young people involved? I was speaking at a climate justice conference, 10,000 students in DC a couple of weeks ago, 300 people in the meeting against nuclear power and stuff. So it's about bringing in different movements, because the anti-nuke movement is connected to, well, what kind of energy system do we really want? And so I think for a long time people have been questioning, well, climate change, it's such a huge thing. We're talking about changing the whole of civilization. Where do you start with that? Well, I think an anti-nuclear movement, just like the anti-fracking movement, or just like the mountaintop removal movement, I think these are places that you can kind of insert yourself, and you could actually see that we could get a victory, right? And so I think that we could go around badgering and dogging these people when they try and hold pro-nuke meetings, shareholder meetings, and so on and so forth, and make it impossible for them to meet in public. Because the other thing about the nuclear power industry is it's totally opaque, right? It's enhanced the national security state, so we don't have any democracy. We don't even know what's going on inside the plants because you can't get in. And so it enhances the militarization of the state, and it makes it much, much harder It's an attack on our civil liberties, really, and whether we have a say in our own energy resources and system. And so, nuclear power is already too expensive to operate in reality. I think what we have to work out is how do we most effectively place political pressure on the people who run the system, right, the politicians and so on, and where does our real power lie? Because I do think the only thing that we have going for us is there's lots of us, right? And so the question is, how do we mobilize and build that? And I think that this coalition is a great, I mean, to have this many people in the room for an organization that's like a month long, I think is fantastic, right? We're talking about rebuilding an anti-nuclear movement that was really, really successful in the 1980s, and that we want to reinvigorate and teach new people and bring them in and try and work out, well, tactics are going to change, right? I'm all for civil disobedience, but it's a tactical question, right? When does it make sense from when doesn't it? When does it, in other words, we have to ask the question, how do we move the movement forward? Does it help to be chaining ourselves to gates or not at this point in time, or should it be next week, or what is it? I think that that's more of a tactical question than anything else. Yeah, well, nuclear power is always hot, but so I think we have to think about, as difficult as it can sometimes seem, and I'll wrap up on this, as difficult as it can sometimes seem to mobilize people. We've already started, right? This is already a great start. Plus, look at the spectacle that everybody around the world has been able to be inspired by happening in the Middle East. So 30 years, people in Egypt were in small groups getting arrested, tortured, killed, imprisoned, right, for years, decades, right, where nothing changed, except they got killed and tortured and so on and so forth by a state fully backed by the United States. And so in just a month, complete change, right? We don't know where it's going to go, how far it's going to go, and so on, but it's already a democratic process through the mass involvement of hundreds of thousands of people. And that is being replicated all across the Middle East and North Africa. And in this country, when you look at Wisconsin, who would have thought that the people of the Middle East would inspire people of the Midwest to say, we're not going to accept this anti-democratic stuff, we're going to fight against it, and we're going to come together, and we're going to occupy the State House until we get what we want. And so that kind of, how do we replicate that and bring it to New York, right? And how do we take caravans to Indian Point or Albany or anywhere else that we need to go and have demonstrations against nuclear power plants? Because I think that that's really the key thing to do in terms of building a movement, because the people who run the nuclear power, to use that kind of language, and really kind of say, well, there is an alternative, and we're going to fight for it.